I've mentioned a few times in this series and on other videos that my big collection for Star Wars toys are the figures. I decided when Power of the Force was relaunched that I was going to get every single original trilogy figure. Whether it was a single card, was a 3-pack, or, well, was a pack-in figure with something larger that I was probably eventually going to toss out and or donate. Now, I'm alluding to vehicles, obviously, and Power of the Force 2 was geared up for vehicles from the start, making sure there were figures released to pilot said vehicles. And there was an ample supply of tooling because Palato Toys, that released Kenner's old line in the 80s, outside of the US, mostly in South America, well, they still had the tools. So that meant Hasbro was able to get a hold of them and take the original tools that while Kenner released them in the US, they were the same versions that Palto Toys had in South America, and the Power of the Force 2 vehicles, at least all of the original ones, were just reissues with better deco of the original toys that we had in the 80s, which in a lot of ways was very nostalgic because you could physically hold the same toy, it had mostly the same weight. Some of the ones that had lights and sounds back in the 80s had those things removed. And, even though there wasn't the right driver for every vehicle, like this stormtrooper driving the Atsta, well, we had all the basic ones. And as the line continued to expand, we started to get more and more vehicles that included figures in them, which meant I was going to have to buy more and more vehicles, much to my wallet's chagrin. I passed on most of them. A lot of the vehicles, though, were really cool, and there were some original ones created besides just the reissues of the old, well, not Kenner tools, but copies of the Kenner tools. But I still wound up passing on almost every one of the original vehicles, and I'm kind of glad I did because as better versions came out in years to come, these ones actually spoke to me, and I started picking them up. I have, this X-Wing, although I don't have the Wedge version. I have the Luke Dagobah version, and, Scout Walkers from Kmart, and Snow Speeders from Walmart, and eventually I realized I did wind up having quite a collection of Star Wars vehicles, and before I moved from California, I donated them all to my daughter's school so I wouldn't have to move this giant box of things I didn't have room to display. I never got this Falcon. Maybe I should have. I mean, when it was like $250, now it's like $700. So, while I wasn't a huge vehicle fan for Power of the Force 2, it wasn't for a lack of liking the vehicles, it was really just display space. The one single vehicle, and I'll probably make a video on this later, is the T-16 Skyhopper. I had to buy this one right away because it was a Skyhopper! We got an action figure Skyhopper! And of course, any vehicle that came with a figure fell into my bucket of requirement. So, much like the Swoop, and the Speeder Bike, and the A-Wing, that were released in Power of the Force 2, well, I scooped up these vehicles purely for the figure. And again, eventually either selling off or donating most of the vehicles that came with them. Kind of the big accessories, right? So the Tattooine Skiff was another figure plus vehicle combo that came out at the very tail end of Power of the Force 2, right before it switched over to Power of the Jedi. And Episode 1 came out, which is actually exactly why this vehicle was so damn hard to find. Pretty much any toy that comes out at the end of a line. And this Skiff was supposed to be paired with a Y-Wing fighter as an assortment, with both of them coming out, no pun intended, in the shadow of Episode 1. At this point, we were very close. We were a few months away, I think about 6-7 months away from Episode 1, and most retailers were clearing out Star Wars to make room for a reset for Episode 1, which meant even Target, which was where this was an exclusive, it was really hard to find because most Targets had passed. And a lot of us didn't have the Skiff as a kid growing up. So getting a new version, even if it was the exact same tool, but with a better paint job, well, it was going to be very alluring. The Skiff isn't like any other Star Wars vehicle. It's actually a battlefield. It's a play environment because so much action happens in and around and on the Skiffs. So, in the background with your sail barge, if you bought it from HasLab, but your Skiffs were where most of the action was happening, of course, until Luke, jumped on top of the sail barge. That's a whole other YouTube video. And that's why we continue to get Skiff Guard and Skiff-related figures over and over again. It's one of the most popular, sort of call it subcategories of Star Wars action figures, simply because it's a vehicle that also had action on it. It's not the first Skiff we had in the modern line. Of course, you have to count the Luke Skywalker personal desert sand Skiff that was with the first deluxe assortment. And I did pick this up as well, more out of I guess, morbid curiosity, shall we say. And though it was technically a different Luke, the boots were a different color, but otherwise it was the same one. Oh, and he had a hole in his back. That's not important right now. Now, it's also not the very first personal skiff we've had in Star Wars toys. That goes to Kenner's mini rig, which came out at the tail end of Return of the Jedi. There were also mini rigs for Empire. These were meant to be personal, smaller vehicles to hit a smaller, affordable price point, and the idea was these were slightly off-camera. The Skiff did show up eventually in droids, so it did have some on-camera use, but it was marketed originally as a slightly, oh yeah, you just missed that. Now, the Tattooine Skiff, as I said, it did come out in the vintage line in the 80s, but at the very, very tail end. So a lot of us did go without the Skiff. And as annoying as it was to put together with all those tiny little pieces and all that jazz, well, getting this new one, which was, again, just a reissue of the original tool, for a lot of us was our first ever Skiff, because this vehicle eluded so many of us, and because there were two Skiffs in the movie, it's kind of like an army builder. Well, I guess TIE fighters and X-Wings are too, but, you know, there were two. It's not like there were thousands of TIE fighters, so having two Skiffs gives you a complete set, if you will. And there was a justifiable reason, even if you owned the vintage one, to now get another. Slightly different deco, same tool, but you could have them side by side. Now, of course, like almost every other Star Wars vehicle, I think except for the Snowspeeder, have been updated with a completely new tool. Well, of course, we haven't got all the vintage toys. We never got the Rebel Transport, that blimp thing. But anyway, that's a whole other YouTube video. So yes, eventually we did get a improved version, which looks great with vintage figures, looks great with modern figures, has a little sand base. It came out in conjunction with the sale of the sail barge, because again, if you're going to throw down all that money on a sail barge, buying two skiffs to float around it is just kind of like getting that, extra coat of paint on the new car, or the rims on your tires, if you will. You're already throwing down all the money for the main sail barge, might as well load up on skiffs. So, very special vehicle because it has such a unique play pattern. Nobody actually gets out and fights on the top of the Millennium Falcon or on a TIE fighter, but they actually engage in battle on the Skiff. But, of course, because I'm a figure collector, this was the main reason I got the Skiff, not just because I really wanted one, much like a T-16, was the Luke figure. I decided every single modern figure, and, well, I meant it. And Luke Jedi has an interesting, I guess, pedigree when it comes to modern figures. It took forever, and I mean forever, to get an accurate one. All of the Power of the Force 2 ones, totally inaccurate. It took until we got the vintage collection to finally get the first Luke since, 1983, that actually had the correct colored, hooded, no-sleeved jacket cloak thingy. I mean, there were a lot of bumps in the road between that Power of the Force 2 figure and the vintage collection. I mean, a lot of bumps in the road, where we had figures of Jedi Luke that were creative choices, and the original one, the orange carded one, again, that black hooded robe, that's not accurate. And why they went with black, I don't know. Whatever version you had, whether it was the original release, the movie theater version, which I had until the blister just fell off the backer card one day. That was fun. It was really hard to find figure, and it was just like, ruined because the glue dried up. And then, of course, there was the version with the Power FX, where to hold the battery, Luke required, I guess, more than just a cape and hood, but...
Is he wearing a cape?
I believe he is wearing a cape.
So, there were a lot of attempts. We had our hood, we had the oddly painted sail barge Total Galaxy figure, which kind of became most of the base for the sail barge figure. He had original legs, but he shared a lot of parts of the chest, the arms, the head, with that Total Galaxy figure. But there is one unique thing that this Luke Jedi figure actually has that no other Jedi Luke figure that had been done before or since has. And I'm not talking about, giant C-clamp arms, but it actually reflects the scene in the movie. Everyone knows Luke's on the sail barge, and then he gets up to, or on the Skiff, gets sail barge, gets shot by this guard, which, by the way, this guard who shoots Luke does not get enough credit. I mean, every stormtrooper, every bounty hunter, every, Ponda Baba out there, and no one manages to shoot anyone, but this guy shoots Luke. So, someone should give him an shooting accuracy Hawkeye award or something. I don't know. But it should be significant. I mean, he actually shoots Luke. All right. Yes. So why is that important? Because this figure actually had that mark on his hand. The only other one that ever did was this 30th anniversary Jedi Luke, but the mark was red, which it's never red. It's much more black. I mean, it's kind of burned metal. But this was Rancor Pit Luke. I mean, you can see that with the bone. They even, threw us a bone there. So we've never really had a truly accurate blaster-marked Luke. This is the closest we've ever gotten. And for reintroducing the Skiff, making perhaps the first Skiff a lot of us ever had because of the late release, and having the mark on his hand, the black spot, if you will, with Jack Sparrow, makes this a very significant release in the Power of the Force 2 line as it made its way through Episode 1 into Power of the Jedi.